Why would we not start with the reflections to what Justus said, or you would add anything in addition? David, would you like to start?
Okay. I think it was a very good lecture, and it raised some points. And I'd like to sharpen the points. I think the basic point is that the EU agricultural policy is totally counterproductive. And I tell you honestly, I really think when it comes down to it, I think that the EU is a big obstacle to the world and to itself. And I tell you why. First of all, we come with GMO. GMO may be bad. GMO is genetic modified organisms. So the basic idea is that you now recently they discovered DNA, and instead of guessing what you do in plant breeding, you try to understand what happened, what every gene is doing, and you modified one gene at a time. Then there is something called gene editing, that someone named Doudna and Professor here, he got the Nobel, he should have gotten the Nobel, a new method how to modify organism. The EU today basically blocks the use of these technologies because there are some people that worry about them. But almost all not almost all National Academy of Science think that these technologies are reasonable. If we would listen to the EU today, you wouldn't have a vaccine against the pandemic because it's again using some genetic modification. So the EU first is against genetic modification. Secondly, they are for organics. Now, what organic is doing, they increase yield, and you increase the amount of land use that you need for agriculture. You need the amount of input that you use for agriculture. So again, it's a waste. So, but the main price is something much, much bigger. And this idea is called the bioeconomy. And the idea of bioeconomy is that you use agriculture to produce not only food, but fuel and chemical, because what happened, we lived for many years basically on renewable resources. Then, as someone said, God gave us oil, but it was for a limited period. Now it takes us back with climate change. But we have this tool that we can double the productivity of feedstock in the world. We can modify it, we can increase. If we use it, we can have a new green revolution that will solve a lot of problems, but this green revolution is impossible. So we have basically energy prices, and basically what the previous session tells us, we really don't know what to do. And you didn't use the best option. Try to use biology. Now, I work in Berkeley, which is not a bad university, and they work on this topic. And it's obvious that the EU today blocks the two most reasonable options. One is called nuclear, and the other is called biotechnology. And for what? For organic? Organic food is not better than other food. So to some extent, there is an illusion of something that is good for the benefit of small people, upper class people that feel good about themselves, and millions at the end will suffer. So to me, and I don't speak in Africa, even in the EU, even what we used to said, if you reduce productivity and the price of food goes up, you have more people that at the end vote for Le Pen. That's exactly what happened. So to some extent, policies that satisfy the middle class, and believe me, my kids also, like when they invite a girlfriend to a date, they say, gosh, I prepared the salad and it's organic. So organic is sexy, but it's wasteful. So to some extent, I really think that people start to be awake and realize that what's going now with the EU, it's supposed to be good for the environment, but it's disastrous.
Giedrė, hopefully you disagree.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the lecture, Professor Wesseler. So what I would reflect on, that perspectives from the past are not really very well integrated into our sustainability planning for the future. We have a huge package of information, how people coped with climate change. It's not new. We have this thousands of years of perspectives from archaeology, how people dealt with shortage of food, with floods, with climate change, with, as I say, shortage of calories. And what's really interesting that really archaeology can provide these perspectives. And it's increasingly actually become clear that in order to fit that and go in line with that from farm to fork policy, first of all, which one of the goals is to diversify our economy, diversify our our plant species we use. We can really learn from actually lessons from the past, what people grew in the past. And one of the things what we really know, what was like a buffer crop for thousands of years for many of people are millets. And this year, 2023, is actually declared by United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization the year of millets. Millets are small grain cereals, and there are about 20 species of them. They were extremely important crops in the past in Africa, East Asia, in Central Asia, and also in Europe. From 3,000 years ago, we were growing millet in this particular place where we are sitting now, in the palace of our on Gediminas Castle Hill. We are finding large quantities of it. It was a stable food together with other food crops. And if we talk organic, and actually millets are one of those crops which are has the shortest growing period. So some of the varieties can grow from in 40 days period, from seeds to seeds. It has the lowest carbon footprint and also water footprint. It's extremely nutritious, and it's a really resilient crop. So those kind of small grain cereals, like we know now, buckwheat was another buffer crop, especially for Lithuania, in a climate change such as Little Ice Age from 14th century. So yeah, we have to also look at this forgotten crops. It's very important, and not take them and integrate them into our food system, in our fodder system, in our, what we're feeding to our animal, and also learn from also the genetics, the lost genes, what Professor just mentioned, These are still varieties which are present, which we can use and, adapt to different environments. But at the moment, we really eliminated, just 100 years ago, we had 75% more crops than what we are using now. So,
Danny?
Well, first of all, thanks, Professor Justus. For those who don't know, perhaps, Wageningen Uni is absolutely leading think tank in Europe regarding everything what is about agriculture, agro-industries, agro-social issues. Yeah, so they are think and they are tank. Yeah, so they are. That's where the brains are. And each time I listen to the Wageningen folks, I am fascinated because they really manage to challenge what is common wisdom. Yes, it is common, but is it wisdom? Yeah, so I want to second many of ideas presented here. You saw the conclusion. Yeah, farmers benefit, consumers pay, environment questionable. And 4 aspects I would like to touch. First would be global. Second would be historical. Third would be European. And fourth would be personal. But that's subject our time and subject moderator's allowance. Starting with global, I would start with number. The number is $3.66 per day. That is according to FAO, Food Organization, Global Food Organization of United Nations. That how much does it cost for the average person in the globe to pay for the healthy diet per day. I know that most of you probably won't agree after your last supermarket bill, but frankly, nobody cares, because it's between you and your supermarket. The number is correct. In Europe, it's even $3.2 per ton. And that's not a problem. The problem is that 3.1 billion people in the world cannot afford this. So the world today is still cursed with food insecurity and with hunger. And this country is blessed with a very moderate temperate climate, with a very good soil, contrary to some Estonia, where it's nothing but rocks. Yeah, and good farms, good productivity. Again, some of you know, perhaps not all of you, but as regarding wheat production, per capita, we are number 1 in the world. We produce 2 tons per person. Everybody else is distant second cry to us. We are absolutely the best. Now, where that wheat goes, easy to guess. Our biggest export market is Africa, Nigeria number 1, South Africa number 2. Now they say grow grains. But we don't have customers in Brussels. They don't eat baguette out of our wheat. Guys in Lagos eat baguette out of our wheat. They don't ask organics. They don't ask fertilizer-free. They ask cheap wheat. They ask more. So don't you see discrepancy? Do you see the clear logic in the policy? I have my doubts. I have my reservations. I'm happy that Wageningen share the doubts. Yeah, so that would be the first question about how wise is this common wisdom. So what was the net result? We lose the revenue, our farmers. We lose the market, which took us time. We lose money. And what do we get? I don't see anything. Nothing. So why? Why do we need this? Why is it deal? As for Lithuanian voting, keep it. So for GMO, I second you. I fully agree. But for farm to fork, very weird, to say that.
I would agree that many countries, or in particular Lithuania, may not gain individually so much. And that was basically my point, that in many cases, countries with the current level of policies that we have, they can all change. And there is a basic message, right? We have to do more than we currently are doing. And in particular, if you look at these smaller countries like Lithuania, there the farm sector, because of the economic size, will also not gain so much. Those that will gain are Denmark, are the Netherlands. By the way, the National Geographic called Netherlands a small country that feeds the world. Lithuania is also a small country, and I think it has potential to grow.
In Dutch, they have 15 million pigs. Those with fallen.
Yes. You may not want to have 50 million pigs. I agree on this. But when you look at productivity differences per unit of agricultural land, I think there's a lot of scope with current technologies that we have available to substantially also increase production here in Lithuania.
No eaters.
You are more skeptical. I think the structural changes in agriculture over time may solve some of the issues that are hampering productivity increases. The same may also hold for many other Eastern European countries. But what we have learned, for example, from German reunification, that these changes take a long time. It's not something that happens over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. When we look at German reunification, it takes 25, 30, it may even take 40 years before catching up has taken place, even within one country. So the spillover of new technological change also requires a lot of changes in the institutional environment, and they are extremely important. Now, coming to what you have said with the diversity, I fully agree. It would be nice to have more diversity. At this point in time, it doesn't seem to pay for farmers to cultivate millet, to cultivate buckwheat and other kind of crop. That would be nice from a diversity point of view, but from a profitability point of view at farm level, this does not pay yet. But there, technological change is also extremely important. You can have for example, due to plant breeding, better millet varieties that are more adaptable to the local environments, etc. But there we observe at European level that implementing these technological changes that would really help due to the decision-making procedures that we have at EU level, they are blocked, or it takes much more time. We work on a project, for example, for low-risk pesticides that are supposed to substitute the hazardous pesticides that are now banned in the European Union. Still, for getting those mainly biological pesticides through the approval process takes 3 times more than for the same product in the United States. And we looked at the hazard assessments that they do, and we couldn't identify any difference. In the US, you have to submit the same hazardous criteria, risk assessments, as in the European Union. But here it takes 3 times longer. Why? These are the obstacles. And that is what policymakers have in their hand. The farmers say it's not a technical problem if the technologies will come. But it's an institutional issue.
You once compared the corn in the EU and the US. What do you think?
With respect to the approval lengths?
Yes, no, in terms of productivity and profitability.
No, the profitability in the European Union is higher than in the United States on a per acre or per hectare basis. So the maize revenues here and the yields in the European Union are higher than in the United States. In the United States, you have larger farms.
I know, but the key element, if tomorrow you would allow GE corn in the US, what will happen? In the EU, what will happen?
Yeah, yields will substantially increase. And the farm income, so we did some studies on the benefits of Bt maize, which is a herbicide, insect-resistant maize variety. There's one variety approved in the European Union, which is cultivated in Spain only. It has been cultivated for 2 years in Germany and 3 years in France, but then the governments decided to ban this. And we have seen that there are yield increases, in particular in France, where the European corn borer, which is a pest that is mainly controlled by the Bt maize, is a substantial pest. But France did ban it. It was the pressure from the environmental groups. In Germany, it was the same. It was the pressure from environmental groups, and then the governments have given in. Romania, before it joined the European Union, had herbicide-resistant soybeans cultivated. They had about 200,000 hectares. After they have joined the European Union, they couldn't cultivate them anymore. Now they cultivate a little bit more than 10,000 hectares in Romania on soybeans, because the problem with the weeds are so difficult to control with the current pesticide levels solutions that we have available than with the herbicide resistant ones. And there are many other examples where new plant breeding technologies can help to increase the productivity in agriculture, and goes beyond when we think about...
What do you think about Africa? Europe affect Africa. Europe tell Africa what to do to some extent.
Well, in these models, the calculations are also showing that it has negative effect on the rest of the world. And in particular Africa that is suffering from the increase in food prices at world level. And the European Union to a certain extent has also some responsibility. And I agree also that Europe to a certain extent has an influence on the decision making in Africa. Like the approval of Bt maize in Kenya, due to pressure from the European Union, has been delayed. The same is with bananas in Uganda. European Union or environmental groups from Europe have executed pressure on the governments to not introduce these new technologies. And that is where we have to rethink, where we need this change in mindset here in the European Union, which also will have an effect not only for Europe, but also for many other parts of the world. And when I look, for example, now at the latest BRICS meeting, that is for me also one of the outcomes. And some countries feel too much dominated or influenced by views from either the United States or from the European Union, and they would like to get a little bit more independence. They seem to be put under pressure there, and that is where China jumps in and seems to be able to create a third basically block that may affect world policies. And I think we will observe a change in the world order, because this is becoming now, with the new BRIC arrangement, a very powerful group in world politics.
Well, let me ask you a question. My feeling is that if the EU doesn't change their approach towards biofuel and other energy, eventually they would be secondary to the US and China.
Absolutely. They will lose in comparative advantage. We had a project, for example, with a transgenic tobacco variety that is producing cyanophycin, which is a biopolymer that you can use, for example, for wrapping material that substitutes fossil fuel-based cyanophycin. We cannot do these field trials here in the European Union. We had to go to Argentina, for example. And the products seem to be difficult under the current situation to be imported into the European Union without going through an approval process. But Europe is giving up. The transgenic tobacco has been developed at Rostock University with other colleagues. And it would be fantastic, for example, for tobacco farmers in Poland and other parts in the European Union that have to move out of tobacco production for many reasons, but they have the knowledge of producing tobacco, and there you would have an alternative where you could use a tobacco plant as a very nice substitute. The guy from Philip Morris, if he's still here, maybe this would be something they could investigate in more detail, because they know all the tobacco farmers. This is one example, again.
And we have the question for Giedrė from the audience. What can we learn from the past agriculture strategies and how they help to better tackle modern challenges? What crops were successful in the past and now are forgotten? What are the reasons for this?
Right, so basically we always see that successful societies are always the ones who cultivate wide spectrum of crops. And we talked about the wheat as being the Lithuania's the biggest producer of wheat, but it's actually wheat is such a new culture, the bread wheat. Out of 20 species of wheat we cultivated in the past, now we have this high water and fertilizer demanding crop, which we're investing into, and all the technologies investing into its resistivity to pesticides, to diseases, to other things. So I don't know how much longer we can maintain such a system. So people really had very diverse strategies and in how to manage droughts, and very clear correlation. When there is a climate change, you have straight away diversification of crops happening within a different civilization, from China to India, and for instance Mayan civilization were relying too much on maize. That was part of a reason, that's again shown by many scientists, that was part of a reason why civilization collapsed. They weren't able to adapt the maize planting to the shift in rainfall. So it depends on the region. In Lithuania we had lots of legumes, lots of as I say, millet was always a stable crop. We had also, very importantly, lots of varieties of barley, which again we kind of withdrew. Now we mainly use two-row hulled barleys, but we had at least 5 varieties of barley, which is one of the most resilient crop together with millets.
Dan, a question for you. Do we have time for major modern agriculture investments in Lithuania? Where the money would come from?
Oh, good question. Time. We have all the time in the universe. So depends what we are talking. If we are talking specialties and super specialties, it means expensive products, new products, which will travel far. Biotech. We have no limit. Yeah, if we manage to sell globally, if we can compete versus Japan and America and Singapore, and then why not? Yeah, whenever we succeed with such investment, then it's fine. If we, however, talking commodities, now it's more challenging question, because as I mentioned to you, European is a very efficient producer, but I'm afraid before war in Ukraine is over, it's too early for those investments, because capital will consider them as too risky. While after the war in Ukraine is over and reconstruction starts, it might be too late. because Ukraine is definitely a lower cost producer than anybody else in Europe. Yeah, so in that respect, the window of opportunity will exist, but it won't be very, very big. Yeah, that's my personal opinion. Please don't bring to the bank.
Can I say something? Now, generally, there is, if I was a farmer unless I was super efficient, I wouldn't go wheat. There is generally excess supply of calories. The world in all the issues, the world of Ukraine really didn't change that much the price of risk. The big issue that we have today is when it comes to protein. There is a crisis of protein. How can you produce more protein? And there are many ways to produce protein. So to me, if you can use modern technologies, and I know that people ask about the precautionary principle, but with all the due respect to the precautionary principle, nothing bad happened with GMO, even though we grow it 30 years, and we grow it in countries like India that are not the most careful countries. So to some extent, you can increase the amount of land that you can use to produce food, and you can reduce the price of food, and then you start producing biofuels. I'll give you an example. If India can produce rice with 30% increase in yield. If they take this 30% of the land and you use it for sugarcane, suddenly they have enough energy to replace half the gasoline that they use. So to some extent, I can give you more and more examples. But the thing today, because of all these European policies is happening, is that Europe were a powerhouse of genetic research and ideas. You can go to millet and other crop and find genes that can double the yield. Someone in the United States actually discovered a GMO variety that increased the productivity of photosynthesis by 40%. People now start using, develop with CRISPR a trait that you can reduce the amount of fertilizer that you need for corn by about 30 or 40%. So to some extent, you can double or even more the amount of feedstock that we can produce, and then we can continue to feed people. The price of food will go down, and you can use it to fill some of the gap in energy. So to me, that is a big issue. We really speak about a much bigger game than the food game, because the issue of food security is income distribution. And to me, you need to have a safety net to deal with it. But there is a much bigger issue of sustainability and solving the energy problem. And if we forget the land and the water and the other resources and genetic material, and we try to use other resources that are not very useful, we have a problem.
Question from audience to everyone but David, because David's approach to that question is very clear. Should EU remove subsidies to agriculture or the tariffs or both?
So my personal view is that they should try to remove them. You should not do this perhaps from one day to the other. Markets need to have time to adjust to these changes. Otherwise, the implications might be too drastic. But I'm generally, as an economist, more in favor of open trade, and that then the comparative advantages come to play. And I'm also thinking that Lithuania has comparative advantages in some areas, so it will be good for Lithuania as well.
Giedrė?
I think the subsidies for fertilizers, for sure, when people will start looking at alternatives. Because at the moment we feed our fields with those fertilizers again to grow those very expensive cash crops. Whereas again, millets, they are organic by itself. They don't need additional fertilizers. And if you compare the field of millet with wheat, bread wheat, without fertilizers, grown without fertilizers, the harvest of millet might have been much better if there is a harsh and hot summer and dry episode of summer. So, and then they are more nutritious. So again, I'm not trying to convince you to all move to millets, but it's something to think, especially when the climate changes. We don't know. Now it's temporal, good environment, but in 100 years, we don't know it's going to get only hotter, I think.
Tony?
Well, to me, fertilizers are not subsidized in Europe, but nevertheless, the question about subsidies is to me is part of the much bigger question for all this farm to fork, for the Green Deal, for energy transition, for everything. The question is who pays. Yeah, and I'm always fascinating all those discussions when we make distinguishing between so-called consumer and between so-called taxpayer. Because in a nutshell, this is the same person, and you know that person. Yeah, so in one case, it is reallocated through the corporate profits, and in another case, is reallocated through the state budgets. But it's a question of power, not the question about availability. So the system should strive to be efficient. What does it take, and what is so to get to have a net gain, and what does it take? What is a more efficient way to use the levers what state has is a big question, because state has a regulatory power, and this is much stronger power than the subsidies, much stronger incentive. So this should be used definitely, otherwise nothing happens. Now subsidies, of course, they are anachronism. Of course, they are obsolete. Of course, they are prehistoric, and they should go down. I would happily prefer this money spent on science and research in Europe, as would probably be Professor Justus. But this is only part of the answer. The system needs to be efficient, and for that needs to find a way to be efficient. But of course, resistance is very strong, and politically resistance is very strong, and we all understand that. That's a reality.
Thank you. And the very last question goes to David. David, in your previous session, you referred lawyers as contraceptive.
What?
You referred to the lawyers as the contraceptive. As we have quite a few lawyers in the room, it created heated discussion during the break whether you refer just to in-house lawyers as contraceptive to all lawyers.
David.
My feeling is you need lawyers.
Food for thought.
But you need lawyers. The current approach in many cases of lawyers is not benefit cost analysis, but basically protect your ass. So if you take a risk-averse approach to protect your client, the net effect is that society is losing. So I'm sure that there are some lawyers that are enabled, but altogether, you need to know where to use the lawyers. And I think that a lot of time, it's not that you don't need lawyers, of course you need lawyers, there is overuse of lawyers, especially when it comes to regulation of technology. I think what happened is that a lot of time we are trying to, we're afraid much more of the losses than on the gains, and therefore we don't take initiatives that makes society lose, and lawyers contribute to this fear against losses. That's my view.
Thank you very much, Justus, David, Giedrė, and Danas. We have a small break.